Welcome, everybody. Hello, hello. Thank you for joining us. I'm Sharon Carpenter, broadcast journalist and your moderator for the next 20 minutes, along with Shadow Hunter star and real-life demon, Luke Baines.
I am in the morning before coffee, I'll tell you that much. Thank you for having me. I've been a supporter of Oxfam for a few years now, and I'm such a fan of the work they do, so thank you.
Yeah, and now we can't talk about Earth Day without speaking on how some of the most vulnerable and poorest communities around the world are being ravaged by climate change, totally devastated. Sadly, it's usually those who have contributed the least to global warming who end up suffering the most from it. Now, Luke and I were recently in Central America and saw for ourselves just how dire the situation is for so many people, so many families. Climate change is one of the main drivers of migration, and it's no wonder. With us to discuss this right now, two incredible women who are out there working fearlessly on the front lines of the climate crisis. We have Maria Mendez, the country director of Oxfam Guatemala, and Ruth Santiago, a community and environmental lawyer who works with a number of groups in Puerto Rico. Welcome, ladies.
Welcome, Shannon. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, you guys at home, we need you to participate as well. Please tweet your questions for Ruth or Maria with the hashtag Oxfam Climate Women. That's Oxfam Climate Women. Yeah. And Luke's going to be looking for your questions, so don't disappoint him because he is a demon after all. Got to be careful. All right, let's delve right in. Maria, climate change is creating huge challenges for many in the dry corridor of Central America. Can you explain, first of all, what is the dry corridor? And can you tell us about some of the major threats facing the region, including Guatemala, where you're out there on the front lines?
Thank you. Yes, the dry corridor is an area between Mexico and it comes all the way up to Panama, down to Panama. And it's a dry forest where during at least the past 5 years, we have had severe droughts and also severe flooding. Both of these exacerbated by the climate crisis. So how many people live there? We can estimate that approximately 4.5 million people are living in the area, and they're mostly indigenous in Guatemala. And this I will focus more in Guatemala. They're mostly indigenous and peasants. So we can find that they are the most affected, the poorest of the poorest. And in these cases, it's where we find the highest levels of child malnutrition. Guatemala has 1 out of 2 children are malnourished. But if you are in the dry corridor, it will be that 8 out of 10 will be malnourished. So it does represent a huge problem. If we don't see that this crisis is not foreseeable that it would end in the nearby future.
Wow, some staggering numbers there. Now, Ruth, I have a question for you. Over the past few years, Puerto Rico has had to deal with devastating hurricane seasons, leaving thousands homeless, without healthcare, food and water, the basic needs. What's the current situation in Puerto Rico, and how much worse do you think this is going to get as the climate crisis worsens?
Yeah, so the fossil fuel industry has taken advantage of both the crisis after the hurricanes, the current COVID-19 crisis, the situation we had earlier this year with earthquakes, and they're advancing the rollout of fossil fuel infrastructure, especially so-called natural gas, methane, LNG ports. They're planning, along with the government, with the undue influence they have on the government, to build all kinds of new methane gas, LNG, infrastructure, ports, to flood Puerto Rico and the Caribbean with fossil fuels, with especially fracked gas from the US. And that's the current situation. The people here in Puerto Rico, we are working towards another alternative that has to do with on-site solar and alternatives to this centralized kind of generation.
No, I just want to say to you guys at home, we are coming at you from all over the world. So we do have a few connection problems. So be patient and please bear with us. I know, Ruth, when we spoke the other day, you also mentioned that the coronavirus crisis has just compounded what's been going on in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's been one crisis after another. After the two big hurricanes in September 2017, which we've not recuperated from totally, we had a situation with earthquakes. Last summer, we had a drought, especially in southeastern Puerto Rico. There was water rationing. That's also related to the electric power plants here that are using a lot of the water that people need to survive. And so, yeah, the crisis is just compounded by all of these different climate related issues and others that are not necessarily climate related, but that do create a crisis here.
Ana Maria, back to you. In Guatemala, many other countries as well, women are impacted more severely by climate change. Why and how is this happening? And how are the women in these communities fighting back and building resilience?
Yes, yes, indeed, women are being more affected. And why? Why would that be so? First of all, women are supposed to be providing for their households because most of their partners have migrated or have internally or majority externally. They try to make the move in order to seek a minimum subsistence in order to keep their families more or less okay. That is one chance. The second chance is that women are also in charge of the health and the nutrition of their children, which they, without water, it is very difficult for them to generate any kind of crop. Mostly nothing works because if something is starting to bloom, then they will have floods and then they will have droughts. So really, it's very difficult for them to do that. But it does not only impact the health and the nutrition of the children, it impacts severely the nutrition of women. If you see that infant and mortality rates are higher in these areas, and also they're subject to a lot of, there's a lot of violence against women in these areas. There's a lot of stress, economic stress, but also there's a lot of women going all around to fetch waters in very far distances and places also exposes them to be sexually assaulted. So we do have many conditions, and these women, mostly they are, at most they have 3 years of schooling, so they're mostly illiterate, and at the same time they are the ones that are receiving the best and participating the best in most of the workshops and everything in order to adapt their crops and also to learn about nutrition and sanitation.
Now, Ruth, in Puerto Rico, do you see women suffering more in this crisis as well? In what way? In a similar way to Guatemala? And what should the US government and others be doing to better prepare for the worsening climate emergency?
Okay. Yes, absolutely. Women are also at a disadvantage because especially elderly women are being increasingly left alone by families that are now, the working age people are migrating to the States at higher rates than ever. And so we have especially lots of elderly women on their own without the family support that traditionally they would have had. And so what we need is for both the federal government, the Puerto Rico government to support a transformation of the electric system, for example, that would allow for massive renewable energy installations on site, like rooftop solars. That would create a lot of jobs so that people could stay on the island, working age people could stay, and in conjunction with other programs like energy efficiency and just energy conservation, we could become more viable as a place and be able to resist the increasing and more intense hurricanes that we're seeing with the climate change. So that unlike after Hurricane Maria, With the current system, it took down the whole transmission system from one end of the island to the other, and people in communities who were without power for months and months. With a different kind of system, like on-site solar, for example, people would be able to restore their power quickly after the hurricanes, which we know are going to be more frequent and more intense because of the climate crisis. And so
and if
we
these
need the
changes
government
aren't made,
to support that kind of transformation.
if these changes, if you don't get this support, what could be the outcome?
People are more and more vulnerable because the electric system will continue to fail if it's not totally transformed to on-site generation. As long as we're still depending on the big power plants here in southern Puerto Rico to transmit energy across the mountain range and into the San Juan metro area, most people are going to be without power for a long time, relying on that old system of fossil fuel plants burning fracked gas from the US.
Now, this question is for both of you. You're out there in some of the worst affected communities doing fantastic work, by the way, so we thank you for that. But what are some of the stories of strength and resilience that you have witnessed that really stand out in your mind? And Anna Maria, you can go first.
Well, you had the opportunity to come to Central America, no, and be in the dry corridor.
Yeah.
What is most impacting is that these women that have no education and that are also struggling how to make ends meet with which they know they will never be able to do so, that work 16, 18 hours a day. They are also the most organized human rights defenders. In a country where to defend the land, to defend the natural resources, can mean your own death. If you see the indexes of land and human resources defenders, it's extremely high, unfortunately, in Guatemala as in many other countries in Latin America. This struggle between natural resources and livelihood, and the right to have at least the access to water, and to generate and complain about those actions and measures that economy is taking forward, but it's also ruining the livelihoods because of climate impact. So these women, they don't understand what climate impact is, but they do know that it wasn't like this when they were little, like when their fathers and ancestors were little. That is what they are looking forward now. They cannot understand whatever technicality, but they just know it is not right. And they're willing to fight just to at least give it back to their children and their generations to come. So I think that's very admirable on their behalf. And I really recognize their tenacity and audacity to do so in such a complex context.
Ruth, do you have any stories of strength and resilience? I'm sure you do, that you can share with us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things, there are a few things, but one of them is that we're starting to see communities throughout Puerto Rico doing pilot energy projects, because people, one of the lessons learned, especially after the hurricanes in September 2017, was that people need to participate in the electric system here in order to guarantee that service for communities. And so we're starting to see small community pilot solar, rooftop solar projects that people are carrying out, doing small installations, developing small solar kits, and otherwise becoming energy literate, so to speak, so that we don't depend on these fossil fuels as much anymore and on these centralized transmission systems. So that certainly gives us hope. And that's part of what some of those groups are in our movement, in our platform called Queremos Sol, We Want Sun. It's a civil society proposal that groups together organizations that are community-based, environmental organizations, labor, professional groups, academia, all working together to promote the transformation of the Puerto Rico electric system. And the name in Spanish means we want sun. So basically are proposing that alternative as a civil society platform, contrary to what the direction that the government is pointing to, with more and more fossil fuel plants and wanting to bring in a lot of fracked gas from the US. So that certainly gives us a lot of hope. And the reason why we're working so hard to transform our electric system in particular is after the hurricane, we saw so many people. I remember one elderly woman here in southeastern Puerto Rico in Guayama, literally living in the shadows of the AES coal burning power plant in Guayama, Puerto Rico, and not having power, although she's living with all of the contamination, both in terms of air emissions, and now with the COVID-19, we know there's a recent Harvard study saying that people who are exposed to long-term contamination are more vulnerable to actually dying from the COVID crisis, from the COVID disease. So that's why we're working so hard for the transformation through Queremos Sol and other alternatives, all of the organizations that are part of that platform.
Great work indeed. Now, before I hand things over to Luke, my last question for you is, what can the rest of us do to help? Anna Maria?
Well, I think it's time to continue raising our voices. Climate change is not an issue that it only happens in a workshop, in a global forum, or in international agreements. Climate change effects are happening everywhere, and we are all responsible for that. We must get involved, we must raise our voices, and we must also support the voices of those who have small voices in the international arena. So I think it's important to demand from our governments and also to be very critical. What if our governments are really doing? Because these women in their dry corridor has as much right to an environment that is good and healthy for them as the maximum leader of this world. Still then, we know where the wrong decisions are being taken or not taken, and why is this affecting us?
Thank you. I am actually going to hand things over to Luke now, because we only have a few minutes left.
We do. We do have a couple of minutes to wrap this up. I want to say thank you to both of you for being here today. You know, you're on the front lines doing this every day and giving a voice to people in communities that aren't usually spoken up for, and it means a lot. So thank you for that. I would say 95% of the questions that have come through on Twitter and Instagram in the past 20 minutes have all been how people can help. You know, I spoke to Oxfam about this today. I said, what is the best way that people can help if they're watching? They said it's by getting out and voting and getting people that you know to vote as well. So they've actually set up a text service. If you text Earth Vote, EARTHVOTE, to 56525, they will text you on election day and remind you to remind 3 of your friends to vote. So obviously, the more people that we can get voting, the more people we can, you know, have their voices heard, especially, as Anna Maria said, from people who don't usually have their voice heard. Sharon and I are going to be doing an Instagram live after this to keep talking about some more issues. Do you have anything else to say, Sharon?
I would just hand it back over to Ruth to how can we help?
Okay, so Puerto Rico, as you know, is a territory of the United States. We have no voting representation in the Congress, so we need people stateside who can vote to be aware of the issues, to vote for community-based solutions to the climate crisis, such as on-site and rooftop solar, to obviously combat the fracking industry, the fracked gas that is trying to flood the Caribbean, not just Puerto Rico, but just all over the Caribbean, to take a look at what Congress people are really proposing. And if they just say renewables, they've got to be more specific. Community-based, fence line and frontline communities need to be adequately represented in the government and in those decisions.
Thank you so much, Ruth. All about voting and having a bold plan as well. Thank you so much, Ruth, Anna Maria as well. And Luke, I'll see you on Instagram Live in a couple of minutes.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching, guys.
Thank you.